hand over now to Julie Gottlieb. Professor Julie Gottlieb, she was born in Canada and is a professor at the University of Sheffield in the UK. She works on modern British political history, the history of political extremism, and women's history and gender studies, and her most important publication is Feminine Fascism, Women in Britain's Fascist Movement. And perhaps you have read her interview with the New York Times about the Nancy Astor statue, but she will tell us more about that in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, first of all, to my magnificent colleague, Dr. Karina Urbach, for your generous hospitality and for realizing your vision here of organizing this, unfortunately, very timely event here at the Institute of Advanced Study. It's a privilege and an honor, and just a little bit intimidating, of course, as well, to be addressing the issue of anti-Semitism, past and present, together with Professor Lipstadt and Lord Finkelstein, and to share a stage with these esteemed colleagues who, let us not forget, have made such brave contributions both to the scholarly but especially to the public understanding of anti-Semitism. Now, my contribution will be to talk about the history of extremism and anti-Semitism in the British context, and even more specifically, the role of women as victims and purveyors of hate. I'd like to offer some thoughts about how the history of fascism and anti-Semitism in Britain has informed and resonates with a new wave of populism on both right and left, and symptomatically, of course, the resurgence and the mutation of anti-Semitism and Judeophobia. In November 1938, a couple of days before Kristallnacht, a conservative politician, Sir William Maxwell, was addressing the women's branch of the Conservative Association in Aberdeen. After cataloging all the hot spots of Jewish persecution, he claimed that in Britain there was no Jewish problem, the Jewish population numbering only 300,000, the overwhelming number being in London, Leeds, and Manchester. And then he continued to say that they all knew that while Jews mingled with the people they settled among, they remained apart from them, a peculiar, even an unpopular people. Okay, so the first thing you're going to say with friends like these, right? But it is very much a question of scale, and will immediately be struck by the glaring paradox in the British case. Britain was the European country with arguably the cleanest record on political anti-Semitism and its culmination in the Shoah. Not by any means spotless, but we're speaking here in relative and comparative terms. Today, though, it's the setting for some of the most vigorous and vitriolic discourse about Jews and debates on anti-Semitism. It's never a good thing, let's put it this way, when Jews are news. This point can be punctuated in many ways, but possibly the most dramatic one to note is that in December 2019, so just 2 months ago, the Simon Wiesenthal Center deemed Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn the greatest global threat to Jews. How times have changed. Indeed, it was against a very different backdrop that I began my research on women in Britain's interwar fascist movement, similarly in the early 1990s. I started this work, as I say, in the mid-1990s at a time when, despite the regrouping of the far right in the British National Party and its worrying electoral success at local level, especially in the East End, fascism and anti-Semitism seemed to occupy a political space safely at the margins. Fascism had been largely discredited and delegitimized and consigned to kind of a dark age before 1945. By the end of the decade, of course, the verdict in April 2000 in the David Irving v. Penguin Books and Deborah Lipstadt trial was a great vindication of the truth and confirmation that Holocaust denial was beyond the pale. I could not, nor would I have ever wanted to predict that those were in some ways halcyon days, and that the historical material that I worked would again be so salient in my own lifetime. The growing feeling of malaise has been exacerbated by who I am and where I come from. I'm a first-generation Canadian, the daughter of parents who were child survivors of the Holocaust in Hungary. And then in their youth, they escaped to Canada, where they arrived as refugees in 1957. I myself made the choice to return to Europe, and I want to stress, especially on this day, or since the 31st of January, that Britain is still Europe, where I studied and I have taught for the past 25 years. Now, to immerse myself in the history of the 1930s was hardly accidental, and it probably goes without saying that my scholarship was used, of course, to unravel many ancestral mysteries. Having said that, I turned myself and my attention to Britain, not to continental Europe. I turned my attention not to the victims, but to the perpetrators, and even more specifically to fascist women. Strikingly, the first fascist movement to emerge in Britain was called the British Fascisti. It was founded in 1923, and even more strikingly, it was founded by a woman, a young woman called Miss Rotha Lintorn Orman. In the 1930s, Sir Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists was 25% female. They had their own women's section, and sensationally, it's a small number, but it was used, and it's actually been reused to great effect, exaggerated, I think, but 3 of Mosley's female followers had been suffragettes in the lead up to the First World War. So this was very counterintuitive on many levels. Now, working this terrain required me to challenge a priori ideas about women's nature, about assumptions, about the exclusive marriage between feminism and progressivism. I sent myself careering out of my comfort zone by making contact, by interviewing those who had been active in Mosley's movement. Still, some were in advanced old age and ready and indeed quite eager to speak. And of course, what was particularly noteworthy here is that they were largely unrepentant. For instance, I corresponded with Diana Mosley, wife of Britain's fascist leader, Oswald Mosley, but also confidant of Hitler. And I knew full well what she thought about the Jews, and I of course, also noted that after the war, she had relativized the Shoah to play it down, to deny its singularity as an atrocity, and certainly she would never have gone anywhere near the language of genocide. So the challenge was to understand these women as more than, on the one hand, the sufferers of some kind of false consciousness, who were themselves victims of kind of a fascist machismo and a fascist misogyny. And on the other hand, to try to depict these women as more than kind of paper doll villains, witches, and evildoers. I wanted to avoid the temptation to see them as kind of black shirts on broomsticks, if you like. So the title of my first book, Feminine Fascism, was, please note, deliberately not feminist fascism. That would have been just as alliterative, and of course it would have been much more provocative and headline-grabbing. But one of the central points is that we have to acknowledge women's political engagement and agency outside of the framework of feminism. So would I have come to the same conclusions had I worked this project 20 years later in our own present moment in history? I think it's a question worth asking. So in the British context, there were many signs that the political pendulum was swinging and pretty much out of control. It's difficult to pinpoint one moment of kind of apprehensive epiphany on my part, but if pushed, I would say, of course, it was the shocking murder of the MP, the Labour MP, Jo Cox. She was killed during the UK's EU referendum campaign in 2016 by an assassin who was inspired by fascism and neo-Nazism. And this tragic turn of events opens the areas I want to discuss a little further now. We can tease out a number of the strands of this tragic event to illuminate the changes and continuities in the history of extremism and anti-Semitism in Britain. So first I'm going to give a little background to the British far right, and especially the British Union of Fascists, an organization, let's remember, that trumpeted the slogan, Britain First, in the 1930s, and well before Jo Cox's killer, Thomas Mair, shouted, Britain First, this is for Britain, in his murderous rage. Second, I'd like to think more about why it's relevant that the victim of this political murder was a woman. And here's some more context to the horrendous spike in violence and threats of violence against women in public life in the present. And even more so, of course, this applies to minority women. Third, from there I'm going to argue that the category of gender is actually fundamental for our understanding of anti-Semitism past and present. The DNA of anti-Semitism, to continue with socio-medical metaphors, is made up of what I would call a double helix of hate, racism, and sexism. Finally, I'm going to bring all these elements back together, these disparate strands, to frame the story of a very recent controversial event that Karina has already mentioned, and one that has important Anglo-American dimensions, namely the unveiling of a statue of the first woman MP to take her seat, Nancy Astor. And that happened 100 years ago in November. It was always going to be tricky, of course, to make a feminist icon of the Virginia-born, prejudiced, pro-appeasement Tory woman who first took office because her husband was elevated to the House of Lords. And I suppose Daniel will be able to tell us more about that from an insider perspective. But nonetheless, the whole matter got even further entangled in this cyclone of anti-Semitism that dominated the weather map during the general election in November-December 2019. So, what was the nature of that first wave of fascism in Britain? The most successful organization to model itself on Italian fascism first and then align itself with German National Socialism was Mosley's British Union of Fascists. It was formed in 1932. It reached its greatest point of strength in about 1934 when it had the support of the Daily Mail and Lord Rothermere, the press baron and the owner of the Daily Mail. It went into decline thereafter, and it ended its days in 1940 as a prescribed organization under the Defense Regulations, Defense Regulation 18B more specifically. So why did fascism fail in Britain? A number of peculiar characteristics of British political culture have been used to explain why fascism remains on the margins. And I'm going to allow me to go through a couple of these at breakneck speed, but obviously we can look at in more detail at many of these factors. So what are those factors? The first, past the post electoral system, which tends to not give political space to extremist movements. Britain's physical isolation as an island apart from the continent. The success and stability of conservatism on the one hand, and the constitutional and evolutionary nature of laborism on the other. The pattern of gradual recovery from the shock of the Great Depression that denied Mosley the crisis that he was depending on. The ethno-religious makeup of the British Isles. Another factor, of course, is that Britain is on the winning side during the First World War. It doesn't have access or recourse to the stab in the back myth that fuels the far right on the continent. We have a national history, too, of evolutionary rather than revolutionary change. Very powerful here, too, is a vague but character-defining idea of British tolerance and pluralism, ideas of fair play, of support for the underdog. Let's also remember the class structure. And here, the monarchy and the aristocracy are kind of blocking elements here. The way that the elite adapts to mass democracy. Let's think, of course, about the continued popularity and the ideas behind something like Downton Abbey as a really good example of that. And even another stereotyped but interesting characteristic is the British sense of humor that cannot abide the silliness and the trappings of fascism. So think if any of you are fans of P.G. Wodehouse, how he characterized the black shirts as the black shorts, for instance. Now, fascism in Britain has been a consistent presence in subtle but insignificant ways. In a general sense, since the 1930s, political legitimacy has derived from and depended on being anti-fascist. It's so fundamental that it almost goes without saying. So we have the construction, of course, of the myth of the British People's War from 39 to 45. Now, this is mythological, it's also problematic, but it's so potent in Britain because Britons imagine themselves to be the antithesis to Nazism. It's telling that in 2005, the BBC History magazine put together a list of the worst Britons in a whole 1,000-year period. And who was selected for this dubious honor was none other than Oswald Mosley. He topped the poll. But I think this might have lulled us into a sense of kind of a false sense of security. I do wonder, actually, if continued interest and prominence of fascism in British society right now actually is more down to seeing kind of fascination turning into fear and hatred. I don't think it's an accident either that Mosley, who was dubbed the Rudolph Valentino of fascism, is now making a comeback and on the small screen. Anatomically and historically inaccurate Mosley figures have appeared in the latest season of Peaky Blinders, which has a big popular following, and in another example in the BBC miniseries World on Fire, which aired in the autumn of 2019. So what does this resurgence of anti-Semitism in the past couple of years in Britain say about continuities and disjunctures in the stories of British political extremism? To be clear, British fascism was never free of anti-Semitism, despite claims that it was only 2 years after the formation of the movement in 1934 that political anti-Semitism was explicitly adopted as party policy. The fascist groups already in the 1920s, particularly the British Fascisti, which I've already mentioned, was obsessed with the alleged power and influence of world Jewry. It spoke openly and with paranoia about the alien menace. They disseminated the infamous protocols of the Elders of Zion. Nesta Webster, who has quite a disturbing following here on this side of the Atlantic, had been associated with the British Fascisti, and she remains one of the internationally best-known conspiracy theorists of all time. Jews were held accountable, to pick up on many of the tropes that Deborah's already mentioned for us, for communism, for capitalism, for criminality, for cosmopolitanism, for the Hollywoodization of British culture and values. They were depicted as sexual predators, as outsiders and infiltrators. And from 1938, the British fascists had already designated the coming world conflict as the Jews' war. So these card-carrying and black shirt-wearing fascists gave free rein and unleashed a reign of terror on Jewish communities, especially in the East End in the 30s. That being said, though, let's not forget that the history of anti-Semitism isn't only about these extreme examples. And anti-Semitism was present and could be encountered at all levels of society, in other political parties, at work, and in social interactions. So let me just for a moment turn the spotlight onto gender. Indeed, a recurrent motif in the fascist anti-Semitism in Britain was misogyny, and this was expressed both figuratively and physically. Jewish women were a soft target for fascist fury, and they were considered fair game for harassment and intimidation, especially in the East End of London. Further, in the fascist imagination, feminists and feminism were conflated with Judeo-cosmopolitanism and decadence. These are ideas that were arguably propelled by kind of deep male insecurities as a consequence of the First World War and women's ascendancy in the electorate. The ideal fascist anti-type, of course, just to give us a real kind of personification of this, was a figure like Rosa Luxemburg, a communist, a pacifist, an intellectual, and of course a Jew. So I've written a lot about the women perpetrators, fascist women who fulfilled their roles as haters and Jew baiters. They transformed motherly love into motherly hate, embracing their biologically ordained roles to position themselves as protectors and defenders of the race and of nation. In practice, this meant that fascist women in Britain protested against the admission of Jewish refugee children, even though that was very late in the day. They hurled abuse on Jews within their own community, and they were tasked with infiltrating women's organizations to spread their hate and prejudice. Fast forward now to the late 2010s. A striking feature of this current global surge of anti-Semitism is how it is characterized and indeed reinforced by sexism and attacks on women. In general, women in public life are being badly affected by the skyrocketing levels of toxicity in the political culture since the EU referendum. and minority women, as I've intimated already, have come in for much of that abuse. More specifically, we can't but be struck by how Jewish women in British public life have been hounded, especially three who have now left the Labour Party, MPs Margaret Hodge, Luciana Berger, Ruth Smeeth, and Louise Ellman. In October 2010, a neo-Nazi attempted an attack, of course, on a synagogue in Halle, which was another very good example of what I'm describing as that double helix of hate. So all of these women are victims of this double helix of hate, targeted and victimized because of their sex and in combination with their ethno-religious identity. Those who have targeted these courageous Jewish women have been borrowing freely from the playbook of the 1930s, and that is the case whether the perpetrators claim allegiance with the left or the far right. So I began with a personal anecdote, and I'm going to indulge you just for another moment to end with another one. An interesting flashpoint of all this, these new mutations of anti-Semitism was the public outcry over the erection of the statue of Nancy Astor, which was unveiled in a very high-profile way by former conservative Prime Minister Theresa May. This occurred on the 28th of November 2019 in Astor's constituency in Plymouth. The date was absolutely not chosen because of the election. That was the precise 100-year anniversary of her election campaign, her by-election campaign 100 years before. But the date became very fraught because Boris Johnson wanted to try to polish his tarnished his tarnished image with women voters by posing with the new bronze statue. A media circus ensued. Now, as the Twitterati did not tire of pointing out, Astor was not the first woman to be elected to the UK Parliament. That had been Sinn Féin's Countess Marwick in 1918. But that was a minor detail, and what really sent Twitter into overdrive was the fact that Astor's political record was a very messy one, to say the least. She's one of the key figures in another book of mine called Guilty Women, Foreign Policy and Appeasement, because, of course, she was a key figure in the whole appeasement campaign. There I try to balance her active efforts at Anglo-German friendship, her back-channel diplomacy with leading Nazis, and her nauseating prejudices. She was anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic, with Southern Confederate family ties, so essentially equal opportunities. Nonetheless, as I say, both from right and left, this was greeted with great whataboutery and perturbation. All right, just to finally conclude, this was a thorny issue for me personally, too, as a woman, as a historian, and as someone from a Jewish background. I felt vulnerable on many levels. The political has inevitably and without choice become personal. Nonetheless, I want to end on a more uplifting note, and it's therefore quite an honor to speak after Professor Lipstadt and before Lord Finkelstein. In Deborah Lipstadt's remarkable and prize-winning book, Anti-Semitism Here and Now, her intimate knowledge of contemporary anti-Semitism, combined with her impeccable scholarship, I think can provide us the guide we need to call out anti-Semitism, to fight it, and to survive it. Okay, thank you.